The year is 1968, a tumultuous time etched deep into the tapestry of the 20th century. The world, still reeling from the aftermath of two global wars, now found itself gripped by a chilling new conflict, the Cold War. It was a war fought not with open battles and declarations, but with spies, proxy conflicts, nuclear brinkmanship, and an omnipresent sense of dread. The two titans, the United States and the Soviet Union, glared at each other across an ideological chasm, each armed with enough nuclear firepower to obliterate civilization multiple times over. Every whisper of a rumor, every satellite image, every unexpected movement on a map held the potential to ignite a global inferno. In this landscape of profound paranoia and calculated risk, the vast, icy expanse of the North. The Atlantic Ocean was a primary battleground. Beneath its churning surface, a silent, deadly game of hide-and-seek was played out daily by the world's most sophisticated submarines. These were the ultimate stealth weapons, capable of disappearing for weeks, only to reappear hundreds of miles away, ready to unleash unimaginable destruction. It is within this perilous context that our story begins, far from the grand halls of power in the frigid waters off the rugged coast of Norway. Our protagonist, if one could call it that, was a Soviet Gulf II-class submarine bearing the designation K-129. This was no ordinary vessel. She was a marvel of Soviet engineering, a diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine specifically designed to carry and launch three R-21 nuclear-tipped missiles. Each one of those missiles represented a city's doom. Her mission, like so many others during this era, was shrouded in the deepest secrecy, a silent, solitary patrol in the vast, unforgiving expanses of the North Atlantic, a constant, submerged threat to the West. The crew, hand-picked and highly trained, were hardened by countless drills, prepared for every conceivable crisis, every one that is, except the profoundly absurd situation they were about to stumble into. The date was August 14, 1968. K-129 was nearing the end of her long, tense patrol. Her crew, weary but vigilant, were anticipating the comforts of home and the brief respite of port leave. Their journey back involved navigating the treacherous Norwegian Sea, a strategic artery frequently traversed by Soviet vessels, yet simultaneously a zone of intense scrutiny by NATO forces. As the K-129, a metal leviathan, approached the entrance to the Kola Bay, a critical naval base for the Soviet Northern Fleet near the picturesque, yet geopolitically vital Norwegian island of Senja, fate intervened with a jolt. Something somewhere went catastrophically wrong. The precise sequence of events leading to the disaster remains elusive, buried deep within the archives of classified documents and Cold War narratives. Whispers abound: mechanical failure, navigational error, and uncharted current, a moment's lapse in concentration. What is undeniably certain, however, is the shocking outcome. K-129, this paragon of Soviet military might and stealth, somehow managed to run aground. It was not a subtle scrape, a minor bump against an underwater obstacle. This was a full-on, violent, teeth-grinding impact, followed by a definitive, utterly embarrassing, and profoundly dangerous embedding of the massive submarine on a rocky shoal. Imagine, if you can, the horror of that moment for the crew. Inside the cramped, claustrophobic confines of the K-129, a world designed for silent, fluid movement, there would have been a sudden, sickening lurch, the grinding shriek of tons of steel tearing against unforgiving rock, a sound that would penetrate bone and reverberate through every nerve ending. The sudden, violent deceleration throwing men off their feet, then the silence. A terrifying, heavy silence broken only by the groans of stressed metal, the trickle of water, and the chilling, collective realization of their impossible predicament. their silent hunter had become a helpless, beached whale. The geographical irony of their grounding only compounded the crisis. They weren't in some remote, uninhabited Arctic wilderness far from prying eyes. No, K-129 was stuck perilously close to the small, charming, yet strategically sensitive fishing village of Skralsvik on the island of Senja in North Norway. This was a place where generations of local fishermen had cast their nets, where families lived their peaceful lives, and crucially, where NATO's highly sophisticated surveillance systems were constantly scanning the waters, ever vigilant for Soviet incursions. The submarine was utterly stuck, immovable, trapped. The Soviet crew, despite their elite training, were powerless. They tried every maneuver in their extensive playbook to free their colossal vessel. They flooded ballast tanks, attempting to lighten their load or alter their angle. They slammed the engines into reverse, churning the water in desperate, futile attempts to pull themselves free. They shifted weight, moving men and equipment, hoping to dislodge their steel prison. Nothing. The unforgiving Norwegian rocks held K-129 captive, a symbol of Soviet pride now pinned like a specimen. Panic, cold and rational, must have begun to set in. A nuclear submarine laden with live ballistic missiles suddenly rendered exposed, vulnerable, and unmistakably present in foreign NATO-allied waters. This was, in every sense of the word, a nightmare scenario for the Kremlin, a diplomatic and military disaster unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, on the Norwegian side, the initial discovery of this Cold War giant wasn't made by a high-tech sonar array or a covert intelligence operation. It was made by a local fishing boat, plying its traditional routes through familiar waters. The fishermen, with their intimate knowledge of the sea, spotted something deeply unusual, a strange metallic glint just below the chop surface, an anomaly in an area known for its treacherous but well-documented shoals. Initially, they might have dismissed it as a new, uncharted rock, a navigational hazard, or perhaps the decaying wreckage of some old, forgotten ship. But the sheer, impossible size and the unnervingly artificial shape of the object quickly caught their seasoned attention. News, as it often does in small, tight-knit communities, traveled fast, not through official military channels, but through the whispers of neighbors, the calls between fishing boats, the worried glances across the dinner table in Skralsvik. Soon, local Coast Guard patrols and junior military personnel were alerted. When they arrived on the scene, the chilling, impossible truth slowly began to dawn on them. This was no ordinary shipwreck. This was, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a Soviet submarine, and it was clearly, demonstrably, profoundly in distress. The Norwegian authorities found themselves thrust into an unprecedented and extraordinarily delicate diplomatic and military situation. Here, in their sovereign territorial waters, was a Soviet nuclear submarine, essentially trespassing and stuck like a monumental beached whale. The ramifications were immense. The potential for a serious international incident, for a military confrontation, for a rapid and uncontrollable escalation was terrifyingly real. The immediate, overriding concern was, of course, the deadly cargo on board, nuclear weapons. Was there an imminent risk of an accidental explosion, a catastrophic radiation leak that could poison their pristine waters and threaten their communities? And what precisely were the intentions of the Soviet crew now that their stealth had been so brutally compromised? The Norwegian military, meticulous in its adherence to strict Cold War protocols, immediately contacted NATO headquarters. Washington and Brussels, already on hair-trigger alert due to constant global tensions, went into a frenzy of activity. The Norwegians were inundated with instructions. Observe closely, do not provoke, gather intelligence discreetly, but crucially assert their national sovereignty. They simply could not, under any circumstances, allow a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine to remain a stranded, silent monument of defiance in their backyard. Back on K-129, the situation for the Soviet crew had become desperate. They were not only trapped and exposed, but likely suffering from significant hull damage, with precious power reserves dwindling rapidly. They knew they were exposed. They knew with terrifying certainty that the world, or at least the entire NATO alliance, was now watching their every move. And they also understood the immense political cost. Asking for explicit help from a NATO nation would be an act of staggering weakness, a monumental propaganda coup for the West. The shame for the proud Soviet Navy and the Kremlin would be immense, a stain on their carefully cultivated image of unyielding power. But the primal instinct for survival, the very human drive to live, ultimately trumped political pride and ideological dogma. The Soviet High Command, agonizingly aware of the gravity of the situation and the very real risk of a catastrophic failure, a nuclear accident, regardless of who owned the weapon, would be an unimaginable disaster for everyone, East and West alike, made the agonizing, humiliating decision to request assistance. The request, sent through the labyrinthine channels of Cold War diplomacy, probably a series of coded messages, backroom phone calls, and hushed conversations between ambassadors, was terse, clipped, but devastatingly clear. We require assistance. Submarine grounded, location off Senja, Norway. The Norwegians, having confirmed the validity and desperation of the Soviet plea, were now faced with an even more profound dilemma. On one hand, the strategic temptation was immense. They could, theoretically, board the submarine, seize it, and gain an invaluable treasure trove of intelligence on Soviet nuclear technology, weapons systems, and operational procedures. This would be a massive, unprecedented strategic victory for NATO, a true intelligence coup of the highest order. But they also knew with absolute certainty that such an act would be universally interpreted as an act of war, a brazen provocation almost guaranteed to trigger a full-scale military response from the furious Soviets. In that hypercharged year of 1968, with the memory of the Cuban Missile Crisis still fresh and the Vietnam War raging, nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to be the one to light the fuse for World War III. So a different approach was desperately needed. A more subtle, a more nuanced, and perhaps a more quintessentially Norwegian approach. The Norwegian military commander on site, a figure whose name has regrettably largely been lost to the grand narratives of history, but whose diplomatic acumen and human understanding were clearly exceptional, realized that a direct military confrontation was not only undesirable but potentially suicidal. He also possessed the shrewd insight to understand the profound, almost unbearable sense of humiliation the Soviets must be feeling. They couldn't just offer standard towing services with a fleet of military vessels. That would be too overt, too much like forcing an admission of defeat. The solution needed to save face, to offer a way out without demanding surrender. And so he conceived a plan so bold, so unconventional, so utterly contrary to the grim playbook of the Cold War that it could only be described as brilliant in its absurdity. A plan that appealed not to political ideology or military might, but to a universal human need, a shared ritual even for bitter Cold War adversaries, a drink, specifically a good, warming, strong drink. The Norwegians approached the grounded submarine, not with the ominous presence of gunboats and armed boarding parties, but with a small, unassuming civilian tugboat. On board this humble vessel, they had prepared a diplomatic offering unlike any other seen in the annals of international relations. They had carefully loaded several cases of Scotch whiskey, specifically bottles of a well-regarded single malt, perhaps something aged, a gesture of quality and respect. The tugboat, dwarfed by the massive stranded submarine approached K-129. It kept a respectful, non-threatening distance but close enough for direct communication. Through loudspeakers echoing across the chilly waters, they hailed the submarine. A tense, uncertain exchange followed, a probable mix of rudimentary Russian phrases, broken English, frantic gestures, and perhaps the cautious raising of signal flags. The Norwegians, through their efforts, conveyed a clear message. They were there to help, they understood the difficult situation, and they had a gift, a gesture of solidarity to offer. The Soviet commander on K-129, a man trained for war, for stealth, for unyielding resolve, must have been utterly bewildered. Was this a trick, a sophisticated psychological operation designed to disarm them, a subtle insult? But then, through the periscope, or perhaps from a cautious glance from the bridge, he saw it. The unmistakable silhouette of cases of fine Scotch whiskey being carefully, deliberately lowered onto the deck of his stranded nuclear submarine. This was not an act of military aggression. This was an act of profound human empathy, a recognition of shared hardship, all wrapped in the potent, warming embrace of a bottle of fine spirits. The symbolism of this offering was incredibly powerful. It transcended the rigid ideological boundaries of communism versus capitalism. It acknowledged their shared humanity, their common vulnerability, despite their opposing political and military allegiances. It offered a moment of unexpected respite, a small, tangible gesture of goodwill in a world consumed by tension and the constant threat of annihilation. And let's be honest, to a crew trapped in a cold, dark, damaged submarine facing an uncertain future, the prospect of a good, warming shot of whiskey probably sounded like an absolute slice of heaven. And so the ice, both literal on the frigid waters and metaphorical in the diplomatic standoff, began to break. The Soviets, after what must have been agonizing internal debate and hurried communication with Moscow, accepted the whiskey. This seemingly simple act, this exchange of a few bottles of scotch for a nod of acknowledgement, signaled a grudging, almost unspoken acceptance of Norwegian assistance, without explicitly forcing the Soviets to admit to a profound military weakness or to needing a full-blown rescue. It was a brilliant diplomatic bypass, a way to move forward without forcing an impossible surrender of pride. Over the next few days, a delicate, almost surreal dance ensued. Norwegian tugboats, equipped with powerful engines and specialized salvage gear, worked carefully and methodically. Their efforts were under the constant, watchful eyes of both Norwegian naval vessels maintaining sovereignty and Soviet naval ships dispatched to oversee their damaged asset. The Norwegians provided their invaluable technical expertise and heavy equipment, patiently working to free K-129 from the unforgiving, vice-like grip of the rocky shoal. The Soviets, meanwhile, maintained firm control of their vessel, allowing only limited, strictly controlled interaction, guarding their secrets even in their moment of vulnerability. The entire process was slow, painstaking, and fraught with peril. The constant fear of further damage, of a catastrophic nuclear leak from the damaged hull, or of an accidental escalation fueled by misunderstanding, hung heavy in the crisp Arctic air. But the initial goodwill gesture of the whiskey had, against all odds, set a fragile but crucial tone. It had created a small, human bridge of understanding, demonstrating that even in the darkest shadows of the Cold War, a path other than confrontation could sometimes be found. Eventually, after several days of intense, concerted effort, K-129 was successfully refloated. The damaged submarine, a stark testament to the unforeseen perils of the sea and the Cold War alike, was then carefully escorted by a bizarre convoy of both Norwegian and Soviet ships, a truly surreal and unprecedented sight in those tense times, as it slowly, painstakingly made its way back to Soviet waters for extensive repairs. The Whiskey on the Rocks incident, as it quietly became known in select circles, was largely hushed up by both sides for decades. For the Soviets, it was a deeply embarrassing military failure, an undeniable exposure of the vulnerability of their strategic assets in the face of nature's indifference and an opponent's cleverness. For NATO, it was a profound learning moment, a testament to the fact that they had successfully de-escalated a potentially catastrophic Cold War crisis through astute diplomacy, a nuanced understanding of their adversary, and a remarkably unconventional approach that never resorted to force. But the story, as all good stories eventually do, eventually leaked out. It was told in hushed whispers by those who were there, slowly corroborated by the passage of time and the eventual declassification of documents. It stands now as a truly fascinating, almost unbelievable footnote in the annals of the Cold War, a testament to the utterly unpredictable nature of geopolitics. Profound absurdity that can emerge even in the most tense and dangerous situations, and the surprising, potent power of a shared drink, a gesture of simple humanity to bridge seemingly insurmountable ideological divides. It reminds us that even when superpowers are locked in a deadly, existential ideological struggle, when the world holds its breath at the brink of annihilation, there are moments where basic human understanding, a pragmatic assessment of risk, a touch of ingenuity, and perhaps, just perhaps, a few bottles of good scotch can collectively prevent a disaster. In the biting chill of the Cold War, a little warmth, even that which emanates from a glass, could sometimes make all the difference, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with diplomacy, empathy, and a dram of single malt. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more fascinating historical videos.